Good afternoon, everyone, and sorry for the delay anyway. This particular one is essentially on can global governance survive the COVID-19 pandemic, a very happening sort of a topic that's been given to me. It was also interesting the way it turned out to be. What I plan to do today is that I would start off with, because there are two components of it. One is global governance, other one is governance. Okay, so in that scenario, I thought we'll start with what exactly is governance, and then subsequently move into global governance, the type of actors, and what exactly they have done so far, and then in the future, what's going to be the case. So that would be a better idea. Okay, so we'll start with, now when we say governance, it involves quite a few components. First and foremost is the question, why governance? Okay, so when we look at why governance, because we understand in international relations as such, otherwise, not from exactly the linguistics perspective or language perspective, when we say governance, it also implies in international relations that there is already an anarchy that's existing. Anarchy simply meaning that we don't have an international government, or we don't have a single institution that can actually control or that can organize most of the things that are existing in the world. Now, given that as the background, when we say governance, it involves few components of it. Governance also means accountability. Governance is also transparency. Governance is responsiveness. Governance is also based on consensus. Governance is supposed to be participatory. Governance is supposed to be also inclusive, and it should have some amount of efficiency, followed by what we call as the rule of law. Now, who defines these is an interesting component. We have seen from the Westphalian system. Since then, we spoke about how nations would not attack each other and all this, and subsequently the Westphalian system could not sustain and could not bring what they imagined as governance for the world of that time, what they had imagined. Because after that, so many wars happened, constantly one after the other, there were acquisitions, there were annexations, umpteen number of things happened across the world. It is in that particular scenario, the World War I as well as the World War II happened. It is only after these two extremely drastic wars that people thought across the world, and quite a few leaders at that juncture, because it also led to the emergence of a new superpower that was in the form of the United States. And we also saw going down of another important actor, that was the United Kingdom. So it is at this juncture, they thought there needs to be some sort of an institution, because prior to the Second World War, they had tried out one of the institutions that failed. And after the Second World War, there was a necessity to bring something that could bring what we call as governance. We also see people using these days good governance and different terminologies. But essentially, when the governance did not work, when it came back with few more additions, that's only good governance. Because the idea behind governance itself that it has to be good. So there is no need to worry too much about what governance is, what governance is, and things. Now, why do we require governance? As I told you, there is a necessity to have some sort of regulations. We also have the system of rules. We also have norms. We have ethical standards that are put up most of the time. That's why you will see during the pandemic, not everybody is allowed. Now, during the coronavirus, not every lab was allowed to test certain things. So there are certain ethical standards. We also are bound by certain regulations. However, we speak about the liberal order, but at the same time, we also have to follow certain common patterns that have been put up across the world by institutions on an agreed component. There is also a patterned regularity that we also have to agree upon, and there is a process. Now, everything is a process. Now, the world that we had post Second World War is not the same world we have had today. After the Second World War, there were only few countries which were talking about things like human rights. But subsequently, you will see in the later stages, many countries have picked up. Like in India, it was not at all a concern, because first and foremost, we did not have rights itself. We were colonized. There were no rights, though there was no question of human rights. So human rights is much more elevated component which came in. That's why I said it's a process that we need to look in. So to manage global affairs through laws, regulations, system of rules, norms, ethical standards, pattern regularity, and to have a process, we need some sort of a governance, which also can be, when it happens between the nations, among several nations, it's called global governance. Now, what are the type of problems that are faced due to which we require global governance or some sort of a structure to govern ourselves in the international system? One, I already mentioned, we don't have a global government. Second, there are all state-centric international systems. Every state thinks its national interest is important. Every state thinks its national security is important. Every state also tend to think at some point of time when it's some sort of a power in the international system, why not me first? That's like what we call as America first, India first, or Japan first, or China first. Every country has its own way of putting it across. Now, these are also something to do with history. These have something to do with their nationalistic fervors, how they have become an independent state, what have they been in the history, and there comes many other components such as revivalism to everything. That's the only thing that comes back again and again. So you have state-centric international system, and then states are also supposed to be sort of legitimate actors. But we are all aware across the world, we don't have one single type of governance system within among the states. If you look in, you have the West Asian region, which also people from the West call it Middle East. Those are the ones who largely have a sort of theology-based authoritarian systems, where you have monarchies, and then they continue to rule based on certain religion or certain books that they have derived from. So you have one set of states. You also have other set of states like UK, Australia, and Canada, who are largely the sovereign monarchies, where they are not republics as such. When I say republic, most of you are aware, they are the ones where the head of the state is not hereditary. So you also still have such systems where either a king or a queen or a particular system is revered, and that we call as the monarchical states or monarchical sovereignty, whatever the way we want to talk about. Then you also have other set of governments which are republics, but yet you may have some sort of authoritarian rulers. You have different people in different parts of the world whom you will continue to see. Their constitution says something else, but the way they rule says something else. There are other sets of one where it doesn't look like an individual is ruling, or individual doesn't sound like a dictator, but yet you will see that particular individual having all power, but he also has a small group of people who will continue to wield power or who will continue to have strength through that one. That's how we see countries like China, where just 7 people sit together and decide what exactly is required for such huge country. So we have variety of states. There is no homogeneity. Because there is no homogeneity, there is no possibility of arriving at one single government or one single system, or you cannot also have a tailor-made system that can say it fits in everyone. It is in this scenario, the global governance becomes much more complicated. What is good for you may not be religiously good for a theological or let's say a theocratic state. What might be good for you in terms of the human rights might not be good for a dictatorial state or an authoritarian state. So some may adhere to certain things, some may deny certain things. So we have this complication that comes with the idea of why we require global governance. So there where states have to become legitimate actors. How do they become legitimate? They join something that can bind them together, let's say in present times, like that of the United Nations. So that binds them together and then gives also some amount of legitimacy. For change as well as continuity in world affairs, we also require certain amount of global governance, because we talk about global commons. We also at the same time depend on certain things to be common across the world. When you go to different parts of the world, you don't want different things appearing to you. So that's actually trying to move towards homogeneity, but at the same time, for change as well as continuity. Now, everybody is debating post-COVID-19, we will have change in the world order. We are going to have a structural change that's going to come in. We're going to have change in the governance. That's something that we will talk in the later part of the part of this particular discussion. Then you also have problems of eroding sovereignty. When you are a smaller state, there are all these tendencies when bigger states or those states which are revivalist, those who have been great powers or superpowers or whatever the type of power they have been regionally or globally, whichever way it is, there are these tendencies that will reappear and they tend to access over certain territories and other things, which is essentially the erosion of sovereignty of certain states. Now, for example, we'll see the formerly Soviet Union states, even today, they're all sovereign, they're all independent, they have their own position with the NATO to all sorts of places. But yet, you will see every time Russia does something, there is this fear. When Ukraine was taken over, or certain portions of Ukraine were taken over, there were tremors that was felt in many of the Eastern European states. Now, that's a sort of impact it will have on sovereignty of a state, which we also can call it as strained sovereignty, because there is no definitive idea of that they can stay on their own. That's why international system is also hierarchical. International system, when I say hierarchical, means we look at them as some sort of power. The power hierarchy is very clearly visible. Now, given that as the background, when the power hierarchy is existing, there are possibilities that the bigger ones may bully the smaller ones. So every time there is a possibility, Turkey may want to do something with Cyprus. Okay, Pakistan may want to do something with some other country. India may want to do something with somebody else. These tendencies also have something to do with the type of leadership they'll have. Now, China has this whole problem of the South China Sea, right? In African Union, you have some of these states having these problems. You have something between Libya and Algeria. You have many other states who also have been having problem. And let's not talk about West Asia, because that itself needs another lecture to be talking about sovereignty as such. So eroding sovereignty is also a major case of concern in global governance, due to which certain smaller states tend to have this tendency or an idea to get connected with the world system, where there is a possibility in the global governance that they may not be troubled or their sovereignty can be protected. Because there is also necessity to have legitimacy as well as accountability in the actions that are taken by even the bigger powers. Now, if United States says something, that has to be accepted. Now, United States said some time ago, Middle East peace plan. Now, that particular component came in and there were calls across the world to say no to it, and then there were different components came in. Certain people did not agree with many of those, so it kept happening at a different level. These are also certain problems that we will see, due to which there is a necessity to have global governance. Now, having said that, now global governance is a purposeful order that emerges from institutions, processes, norms, formal agreements, informal mechanisms that regulate action for a common good. Now, I mentioned 5 different things. Institutions, we require institutions. At the smallest level also, we require institutions. Some of the institutions have been questioned during the COVID-19, including that of WHO, as well as the United Nations Security Council. Right now, these institutions are very important because they carry forward most of the issues that have been put up at the UN level. So you require institutions at the world level, you also require at the regional level. So different depending on a particular region, depending on the requirement, you have institutions that function, but this is very important component. Processes. Now, processes are important. A lot of people would say, why don't all the countries simply follow whenever they have a rapist, whenever they have a terrorist, just follow certain normal standards, catch them and immediately kill them? We always say, when they are put through a justice system, it's a process, because many a times process is much more important than the end. Process is the means, and that means is very, very important because it sets certain standards for the future. At the same time, it sets certain patterns of behavior which will be referred to in the coming days, or for a long time it would be revered as conventions, it would be revered as part of the history. That's very, very important. Now, formal agreements, anyway, we are aware of it. A lot of these things have been negotiated, and many a times you also have people talking about it. You have informal mechanisms which are also utilized. You have 1.5 tracks, you have track 2 dialogues, and many other things which will happen when you have conflicting parties. There is a necessity, because in global governance, the limitation is also that you can't punish a particular country. You can't essentially go and bully someone. There is a limitation to doing any of those things. So in such scenarios also, there is a necessity for certain informal mechanisms. All these are to regulate action for a common good. Now that common good is for the world peace. Rather, I would simply rather say that it's for the betterment of the humanity and for the common good. Now, global governance also encompasses activities at the international, transnational, regional levels and refers to activities in the public and private sectors that transcend national boundaries. Now, in this conception of global governance, cooperative action is based on rights and rules that are enforced through a combination of financial and moral incentives. Now, we had something called as the Millennium Development Goals. Now, Millennium Development Goals have been given a pass by many countries. We have been extending five years for every now and then, and including India, we haven't been able to fulfill to any of those. Now, what are certain incentives that come in? They would say, okay, if you do certain components like this, it is helpful for your own nation. Your own branding comes up, your own value comes up, and it's a requirement as a welfare state. This is how they would probably talk to certain nations which are, let's say, democracies. But to them, they would simply put it in that way, saying that there is a moral incentive that is associated with when you do certain things. Now, in the absence of a single authoritative institution, now, however we resist, there is a necessity to have some sort of an authoritative institution. Now, with the pandemic, you have seen every government and every state at every unit level, authoritarianism being exhibited at a different level. Now, that's at the larger good. We can't deny it. If we deny it, there would be a doomsday, due to which you have this coming in. But many a times, to bring certain changes and to have certain value system in place, there is a necessity to have authoritative institution, or what we call as the world government structure. Now, global governance is comprised of elements and methods from both the public and the private sector, which I already mentioned. Now, these basic elements include agreed upon standards, evolving norms based on shared values, directives issued and enforced by states. Now, methods of global governance include harmonization of laws among states. Now, many of them may say, my laws actually are extremely domestic in nature, and they're very pertaining to my own boundaries, so I may not be able to change. Then the problem comes here is that how do you carry on certain standard patterns, or what we call as the global commons, due to which there is a necessity for states to tone down and leave out that extreme methodological nationalism and then come down to the level of the people, where they need to talk about at the international level. There is a necessity for you to agree upon certain things, and harmonization of the laws is very, very important. You also have the component of the international regimes, global policy issue networks, and the hybrid institutions that combine functions of the state agencies as well as the private organizations. Now, the concept of global governance itself rises actually two sets of issues here. Unresolved, rather, I would say them. Now, one has to do with the claims of the legitimate exercise of the authority, and other with the democratic values. Now, if we have to say, once we agree upon certain institutions of governance, there are certain limitations that come in. How do we really go about it? How do you put out authority? Who are you to say certain things to someone? So there is an acceptance that also has to come from the other side. Now, in contrast to theories of governance at the local and the national level, a social contract between the citizens and the institutions of global governance has not been actually developed sufficiently to constitute a sufficient basis for the legitimacy itself. That is the problem now. That's why WHO has been questioned. That's why you see UNSC being questioned. That's why the whole of UN itself has been questioned. We have institutions such as UNHCR. You have HRC. You have different ones who are responsible to certain components. Let's talk about the refugees who have been struggling, right? During the pandemic, who's actually bothered about them? What have been the case of the global governance? Where have they done, or what have they done to them? Is a question that we still haven't answered as such. That's where the question comes in here is, can global governance survive the COVID-19 pandemic? Means, is it something that has come as such a blow that we need to probably ponder upon and think a little more beyond the regular levels of thinking that we used to do some time ago? Now, in the current conception, global governance implies democratic governance. Global governance also brings together diverse actors actually to coordinate collective action at the level of the whole world that we need to understand. Now, global governance is also inseparable from globalization, which we need to understand because it is dependent on that one. Now, how do you manage this? It is extremely complicated. It is flexible on the one hand. It also has loose system of rules and institutions and processes. How do we exactly manage them is still a question that we haven't answered. Now, there are some who say that liberals claim that global governance has become a prominent feature for global politics since the 1990s as a response and an attempt to shape the process of globalization itself, because it's only after the collapse of the Soviet Union, suddenly you have the emergence of the liberal order coming back to say that probably the liberal order has greater value and it brings creativity in people, creativity among the nations. So it has much more value than that of controlled governments and places. But that's been challenged by China till recently. We don't know what's going to be exactly the outcome of it, which we may have to wait and watch. Now, liberals claim that post-World War, if you look at the number of wars and other things that have happened, comparatively they have been less. So the global governance has been, to an extent, successful. Now, coming back to the pandemics and the type of problem, I had recently written about responsibility and irresponsibility with regard to the pandemic. Now, you will see when there is a positivity, everybody wants to take or plunge into and take a pie of it, and then they would take responsibility. But when it comes to, let's say, pandemics, when it comes to certain global crises, least of the people actually take responsibility or plunge into action or donate or do things that are much more important for the world, not at the time of rejoice or not at the time when everything is going good, that people would come in and do certain things. Now, that's something that we need to understand here. Now, let's put it this way. Now, the goal of the global governance now has been defined as global public good, particularly peace and security, justice and mediation systems of conflict, functioning markets and unified standards of trade and industry. Now, the outbreak and spread of the COVID-19 has created sort of multiple challenges for the entire world. Now, in the post-COVID-19 scenario, I'm using post, not knowing when it will actually end. A key imperative must be to leverage some sort of a crisis to improve global governance. Now, alternatively, the debunking of the international organization and multilateralism as ineffective and to cover up certain misdeeds probably would actually put into greater problems. That may not really be a welcomed outing, but at the same time, there is a challenge that has come in. Now, if we fall into the trap of saying that one probably the global governance may not succeed, it opens a different type of Pandora box. Now, what we have of late seen is some of those people who have been denied entry to the WHO, still it's an issue that has been negotiated and it's been going on. We have been talking about the nexus to a lot of things in international relations. Let's say something like Taiwan and the WHO. In such type of scenario, we have seen that a country like Taiwan has been able to control and work during the pandemic much better than anybody else. This is a fact one has to understand, and one needs to even agree and applaud what they have done so far. Now, what this crisis has also opened up is the fragile systems that are in existence with the mask of calling themselves as superpowers and great powers. Now, the United States has been exposed. At the same time, China has been exposed. China covered it up for a long time. And then subsequently, it probably thought like that of the SARS, which came in and which did not spread too long at a particular point of time. And it imagined that probably this is one time there are possibilities of things not going out of hand and they would be able to manage. But unfortunately, things did turn up that way. Now, the developed world itself is also exposed. If you look in the whole of the Europe, if you just start with now the United States is on the top, the number of people who have died, the system has been exposed, and the number of people who have been positive, and the number of cases that you look in, it's staggering. Then followed by is actually 5 of them are European states. Now, yesterday only, Brazil has come in from South America because of their own ways of handling this particular crisis, where they did not want to have lockdowns and many other. It is here that it gets much more complicated. What I was trying to say is, what we thought would be the world in 2020 or 2021, where you have a superpower, and then you have another one who's aspiring to be a superpower, who's challenging the superpower, that is United States, would be sort of the countries that would be leading the world order and the global governance. But unfortunately, what it has turned out to be is spectacular. But in comparison with any of these great powers and the superpower, many of the smaller nations have actually fared better. Till date, we haven't understood, being that close to, how Portugal has managed to be in this type of a crisis. You have Spain, you have also have on the other hand, Italy. Both have been troubled so much, and both have greater numbers. The number of deaths in Italy has touched 30,000. But at the same time, you see a country like Portugal, which has still been able to manage it. We have South Korea on the other hand. But the European states, which always used to take pride in saying that they have had greater value in terms of managing themselves, and also been able to spend a lot of money on their research and development, on their science and technology, have no clue how to control, or have not been successful at all. Now, how does that happen is an interesting scenario that we need to wait and watch. Coming back to the global governance concept and the way things have been so far, certainly it has not been very helpful. And at the same time, it has not also been very, very positive as such. If you look in, the WHO kept on changing its statements, it kept on tweeting. Being an institution of global governance, it could not actually answer a lot of criticisms that came in. In fact, at a point of time, WHO chief was even called that he has sold himself to the Chinese, and the Chinese were able to control that one in a much better way. That's one of the reasons why we looked at, in terms of the preparedness fund, the WHO hasn't learned anything from the type of epidemic that we had in the form of Ebola. If we had preparedness fund, if we had enough wherewithal, probably we could have done much, much better. And the global governance system could have been much more responsive. This is something that we see here, where redistributive demands have been a major case of concern. This is something that I noted down for the benefit of this particular webinar itself. Now, I was also talking partially about the global governance system, also forgetting certain other governance components that they were supposed to. I was mentioning peace, security, and care as important components in global governance. If you look in, that has been a major failure with regard to, let's say, informal settlements of asylum seekers, as well as the people who are unprepared for this one. West Asian region, you have Syria, you also have Iraq, you also have many other places where you have a massive number of people. Apart from Africa, Africa still has a greater number, which we will talk about. Now, on the one hand, we were talking about lockdowns and isolation, but unfortunately for many of these states, lockdowns as well as isolations were a luxury that few could only afford. Because the problems were, there was scarcity of running water, hand sanitizer, and the impossibility of physical distancing due to the lack of living infrastructure, leading people to stay together. They were chronically at risk much before even the pandemic broke out, because their day-to-day life itself was in vulnerability. Right now, vulnerability is now that we are facing across the world. We all feel vulnerable at this juncture, but these people are some sort of, let's say, vulnerable within the vulnerable. That's the sort of scenario that they were facing. Now, I can give you one simple example from, let's say, the Venezuela. Okay, the Venezuelans in Colombia, the migrants got caught in a strained relation between their municipal and the national government. Now, at the global governance organization or institutions such as WHO were unable to talk to any of the national governments and then tell this is a greater times requiring greater responsibility to be delivered. Unfortunately, weren't able to live up to the occasion. So the people were the one who got stuck in between, and they were the one who were struggling. And on the one hand, Already they were suffering from job losses. Already they were suffering from poverty. Already the nation's economy wasn't doing great. With the lockdown, it went further into chaos. That's the sort of scenario that we had. Now, in that context, probably around 30,000 people have returned through humanitarian corridor. Something partially has been done through informal borders only. Again, informal border crossing is dangerous, but still it has been done. Fortunately, nothing has gone wrong at this juncture, but still it's a major case of concern because many of them moved into Peru as well as Ecuador, which is a case of concern. Now, on the other hand, what some of these nations are part of the global governance, another major challenge that I see is also sort of rise of economic nationalism. Now, in India, for example, all of you will be able to relate yourself because many of you as participants are Indians, you will be able to relate yourself to this particular example that I'm trying to give here. With China being cornered or China being accused of spreading the virus, and people even called it as Wuhan virus or China virus, whatever that way, there is this wave of economic nationalism that has come in India, where people are telling that I think this is a high time we should probably give up on let's say Chinese goods. Now, some of them I hear making this argument saying that we have survived during the lockdown. We have not been extremely relying on Chinese goods. Now, Indian companies should come up and we need to do this. Now, at the same time, least understanding that it's not as easy as we speak over a tea. The global governance as well as globalization, they're so well intertwined that it's not easy for us to separate them just like that, just because of a crisis and talk about it. But this economic nationalism, and it leads to essentially sort of increasing protectionism, which is also dangerous. Now, we don't know because I keep giving this as an example, even in my classes to my students. Many of them are there today in this webinar, that I say whenever we are in some sort of a crisis, there is this possibility of emotions running high and people talking about, let's say there is a war in or there is some sort of a skirmish in the border. People over tea in South sit and say, no, we should just go attack Pakistan, wipe them out of the this thing, what is a map, and all sorts of things, because emotionally people are reacting to certain things. That's happening even here. That's why economic nationalism as well as increasing protectionism, both will become very, very problematic for global governance. So how to survive that one is much more problematic. Now, the scenario I can give you people is, what if Mr. Trump comes back? Now his popularity is coming down because of the way he's handling, he's misguiding or guiding or misguiding, whichever way you want to take it. But at the same time, it's been seen that his behavior has been erratic. To protect himself or to cover himself, he's trying to put the blame on somebody else. What are you exactly doing in the United States to contain coronavirus or COVID-19? That he is unable to answer. Rather, he would say, I have source that can take me to Wuhan, a particular lab, or the Chinese manufactured sort of a virus. This is sort of a different war that has been unleashed on the world, and we need to do something. This is how he tries to cover up. Unfortunately, this is problematic. Now, what if he comes back? That's the question that we are dealing with, right? Will it survive? Global governance will survive the COVID-19 is an interesting question. Now, if Mr. Trump comes back, he has already withdrawn funds for the WHO. He may end up doing many more things that can be very, very problematic. He can also, because he has the power to influence many other states, there are possibilities of many others also joining it. Right? Someone like, let's say, Israel. Israel already thinks, institutions that deal with human rights are discriminatory. They have pulled out from many of the places. Now, if the United States influences, then Israel may join. Then subsequently, somebody else may join. Slowly, one after the other, there can be some sort of a bandwagoning to put down the global governance, which has been, let's say, fairly successful. I can't say completely it's been useless, or I cannot completely deny the fact that there has not been a strain at all. It's some sort of a scenario that we can give 5 out of 10. That sort of a scenario I can see here. Now, with the protectionism coming in, and there's going to be many more actions that the Americans would take, what would exactly happen? Now, many of the European states, many of the West Asian states are also extremely dependent on, or let's say this complex interdependence that we are able to see between China and these regions. Now, probably the stocks that they have and the goods that they have already brought might be sustaining for some time. After that one, it will create vacuum because not all the states have been manufacturing hubs. Like for that matter, India itself is not a manufacturing hub. We have been a service sector. To become or to move from service sector to a manufacturing sector, it will take a lot of money, which India doesn't have at this juncture. India might be trying to do certain things, but still its own startups haven't been great. That's why we keep saying out of 100 startups, maybe one of them is successful, or two of them is success, maybe a success one that we are talking about. So economic nationalism and sort of protectionism are going to be a bigger challenge for global governance that every state has to probably go through. Now, developing countries are caught by the global pandemic while already facing serious constraints in terms of the health infrastructure, liquidity, and the policy space itself. Now, what if China tells Italy, just don't worry about what United States says or somebody else says, you're part of my Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, I'm going to give you money and you accept my goods, and I will give you, or I will help you out with your health and infrastructure too. Why don't you join me? This is exactly what led to sort of a major crisis in Italy. All of you are aware, in Florence, when the Italian Prime Minister, prior to Florence, I come back to the Florence issue. The Italian Prime Minister, at the same time when the American president spoke about stopping all the flights coming from China, he had made this an issue, saying that we should probably think now we will not allow Chinese to come in and the Chinese aircrafts to come in. When this happened, the mayor of Florence took a decision saying that this is discriminatory. The Chinese have been such great help. Chinese haven't done anything. They themselves have been suffering from this one. We shouldn't be taking a different view. We should be, in fact, sympathize with them, also join them and show solidarity. So what he did was he created something called as the Hug a Chinese campaign on Twitter on the 1st of February. So then he said, people can do this one, take a selfie with a Chinese and then put it up. And people started doing this one. This was also one of the reasons, apart from a football match that happened in one of the important places in Milan. This was also an important case that had to be considered. Now, you will have some people who may join the Chinese, and the Chinese will also try to strain the global governance that is already in existence. Because for them, they need to come back. And they also have to resist certain powerful institutions that are already in the control of the United States. Now, the trade is through dollars, which the Chinese have been resisting for a very, very long time. At the same time, you also have the World Bank, you also have the IMF, you have many other institutions that are part of the global governance. Now, many of the developing countries have been recipients of the money that's been coming from here for different reasons. Now, immediately, if the Chinese are trying to influence, it can create very, very different sort of a problem. At the same time, if United States and a few other bandwagon together and they say, probably we need to isolate China and then utilize others and then help them out, that also can create problem. That can also make it very, very problematic because certain developing and underdeveloped nations might be ignored. Who knows? I've given this as an example of even the geopolitics of the epidemics and pandemics in public health, where if Ebola would not have, or the patients or the people who got Ebola would not have traveled to United States, probably nobody would have been bothered about, because it happened in Africa. For a long time, people died, and it's only in the later stages everybody started talking about Ebola. But now, this particular one has spread all over the world, so everybody is worried about. So it is also something to do with who exactly is troubled, how exactly it's getting problematic. That's a challenge that we need to probably look at. So, and let's say we have this particular voice that is coming from the developing countries and the underdeveloped ones, where they would say or put up a combined effort to say, let's cut off all sorts of trade negotiations that we have been having so far, which are cumbersome, including that of the WTO. And at the same time, what do you say, help us out with intellectual property rights. We need to combat a lot of problems that are existing in our own nations, with economy to health to all sorts of problems. So remove intellectual property rights, and then make medical supplies affordable. If they come up with this type of a problem, how would actually the global governing structures would respond? Is an interesting question that I leave it for you people to ponder over and think, because none of the speeches, or for that matter, no talk should be giving you definitive answers, because if that is the case, it will be like a full meal, then and none of us would think further. If I leave with certain questions, that probably would have a spillover effect, and we may think about the future. Now, there is also the positive side and the negative side of the problem that I'm trying to show. There is a prospect for multilateralism. There is also strain on multilateralism. Now, prospect for multilateralism is that you try coming together. Let's say India is trying to do something with certain nations in West Asia, or an organization in West Asia. You also try something to do with the South Asian countries, and probably other regions, including that of Latin America and few other places, where you say there is a necessity for us to come together and fight this. At the same time, there are limitations on multilateralism that comes in the form of, let's say, I'm extremely worried about my people and my border. My national security is important. And you also have these feelings coming in unprecedentedly among people. In fact, if you look in the spread of COVID-19 in India, wasn't this great in the initial stages. It is when people started coming from elsewhere, it all started into a different type of problem, and it had a spillover effect. Now, a lot of people would simply say, at this juncture, let's not become a charitable trust. Let's not also worry too much about what is who's doing what. Rather, let's think about our nation, our security, our sovereignty. Let's seal ourselves and make sure that we live like this. Let's let people think whatever they want to. That should not be a concern at all. Is also one of the ways people try actually putting up certain arguments that have been seen over a period of time. So it has a prospect for multilateralism, but it also has limitations on multilateralism if the states start becoming more and more inward looking. That can create problems. So this is another major concern that the global governance has to have happen. If global governance has to succeed, there is a necessity for many of these multilateral initiatives that have been taken to become successful, because as a team, they grow together, they earn together, they make a difference. Then only the multilateral institutions can go further, as well as support the institutions of global governance, which is also equally important. Now, let's look at a few other type of problems that it can also bring in. Now, there are people, as I mentioned to you, who continue to complain that the WHO itself has compromised, and China has put great effort in past 1 decade, and it has shown its economic prowess, and it's been able to do a lot of things that others cannot do. There was also a point of time people thought, will there be ever a day we can resist the Chinese? From there, we have come to a level where there is certain amount of hatred that has come towards China. Least we have forgotten that Chinese have also been extremely successful in terms of the global governance patterns. If you look in, they have been funding. They have been funding. No institution has been left without funding. That's a type of power that they are able to show. But unfortunately, everything has its own limitations. Because there was a crisis, we are able to make out, or we are able to figure it out in that way. Because many times we have also criticized UN as US, because whatever the US wants, that's what is happening. Now, probably with the limitation of the power that the United States was exhibiting, there is some amount of leeway that we are able to see, where certain institutions have been able to say, even after United States is getting out of it, or United States is has stopped funding and other things, they think it's okay, still we can manage, because there are others who can catch up with. I can give you a simple example. The Paris Agreement happened, and the United States pulled out of it after Mr. Trump came in. There was an expectation that many of the nations will follow the suit, but unfortunately, it did not happen that way. The United States was told, okay, you're leaving, go ahead with it. No, there is no problem, but none of us are leaving. The smaller ones took greater responsibility. Smaller ones, I meant to say, who are not superpowers, like India took greater responsibility. India said, okay, no problem. But India had its own personal value to the Paris Agreement because we were the one who actually made the contribution, due to which we wanted that to be sustaining that way. And we went ahead with it. This is very important. Now, there are many experts who are also telling that the COVID-19 will reshape the world, and the main alternatives would increase some sort of national isolation or sort of global solidarity. Will it lead to greater national isolation or global solidarity? Now, if I have to open it up as a component, it is both. While we are empathizing, we are showing some sort of a global solidarity. The number of people who are dying in Italy, number of people dying in the United States, in UK, in all these places, we are empathizing with them, and we are telling, no, this is bad. This should not be. Whatever that we can do, let's do this. This is also a time where you would see a lot of philanthropy coming in the public sphere, where people are ready to contribute, people are ready to help out others, whatever that they have. We had this classic case in Kerala. When the floods happened, there was this family who's actually an auto driver. He was working with the government before, and then subsequently he started driving an auto, and he had 15 cents of land, and he wanted to give it because he had a discussion with his wife, and they wanted to help in one or the other way, but they had no idea how to go about it. Now, when the pandemic has been declared and the COVID-19 has been up to this level, they gave away 5 cents to the government by saying that you can utilize this. You can use this one for any purpose that you think so. Now, this is something that we see as a thing that brings in global solidarity. Now, an example of this sort would make us to feel that whatever we have, let's contribute and make this world a better world. Now, this also comes from certain selfish motives. I don't deny about it. When we thinking that, what if tomorrow I'm in this sort of a scenario? What if tomorrow my family is in that sort of a scenario? But nevertheless, at the end of the day, empathy is empathy and philanthropy is philanthropy. And whatever that we have done, they go as deeds, which are much more important than not doing anything at all. Those are them who have not done anything at all have no voice to even speak about it. So that's an important component that comes in. Now, this is a divided part. One, you have the national isolation, that a lot of states want to isolate themselves, not want to have trade, not want to mingle with anyone, and then show their strength of sovereignty, have given powers at the local level. Now, this is perhaps the first time you see in India a component such as cooperative federalism coming heavily. Cooperative federalism meaning where the states are able to really behave like the federal units, where they are able to take their own decisions, going to the lowest level where a district collector or a deputy commissioner is able to take decisions on his own, needless to follow whatever the union government or others have said, meaning on the positive side. Let's say a district collector decides that I will have a seal down. He's allowed to have, depending on the scenario, because at the end of the day, he is the one who's answering a question that's been posed. Right? This is the level of breakup that we have seen, but this is a divided house, which is still a major case of concern, and we have to talk about it. The other important component is also, what about the collective responses that are supposed to be coming from the global governance institute? Now, you don't see many of the global governance institutions having opened up or have been able to live up to the occasion. If that were to be the case, probably many of the nations would not have fought. Umpteen number of nations don't even have basic health facilities, which has probably opened up a different type of a problem altogether. Recently, we saw a CIPRI report about the defense spending of different nations. Now, everybody is questioning what is the percentage of, suddenly across the world, everybody is interested to know what is the percentage of the money that's been spent by my own government. What is the amount of money that has been pledged with the WHO? What has been the money that's been given to the WHO to handle these type of situations and do hand-holding activity for a lot of nations which are in concern? Now, that's the reason I'm telling that many of the nations might be anguishing or might be lambasting certain institutions by saying that probably they have not lived up to the component. The global governance has been a failure. If we have allowed a virus to spread like this and this long, and still we don't know what to do with it, still we haven't found a solution to control this or contain this one, has exposed the limitations of the global governance system or the institutions that are responsible here. So will this crisis galvanize the whole of the collective idea of the global governance is still a question that we have to talk about, where many of the nations have been struggling with regard to this idea itself. Now, different states have understood it in different way. Then these institutions are also, when they are struggling. Now, global governance certainly requires certain reforms. Now, what type of reforms? It's not that everything would be done by a certain set of countries. Not everything should be left out to the decision of few nations which think themselves or which propagate themselves as extremely responsible, but it has to be redistributed to several other, meaning you need to bring in many other players into the system itself. That's where probably we are also talking about global order, where the global order should be shaken up, and many of these institutions require a tight slap to wake up and live up to the occasion, which has been a failure now, which we are able to see very clearly here. So this is probably an opportunity to disturb the status quo of the international system, disturb the status quo of what has been so far with regard to the global governance, disturb and probably wake the long sleeping elephant and say, now probably you need to move on. Let's say from UNSC to all sorts of institutions, you need to make them much more humane, in the sense, bring in many other players. Don't think you're able to lead. Have you been able to lead is a question that many of the developing and the underdeveloped nations can ask for. Now they can ask the United States, you were the champion of everything. You used to claim that you're going to be having this right to protect and all sorts of things, which are essentially largely on the security component of it. Why not think pandemics as a security concern? Right? These used to be more of health concerns and many other things, which we still haven't considered as part of the mainstream security issue. That means the traditional security. Probably this is the time to question that status quo and say even the pandemics are a major case of security concern, hardcore security concerns, which have the ability to disturb all the institutions that we have built so far, all the issues that are associated with the traditional security. The traditional security is not anymore that has to sustain in the or remain in the status. So that's why I see this as sort of an opportunity to do so. So in that perspective, if the global governance structure and the institutions are ready to open up or ready to go beyond the status quo, then it will survive. That's my answer for the topic that's been given to me, asking, will it survive? Will the global governance survive the pandemic? It will survive only if it can move beyond the status quo. At the same time, there is a necessity to strengthen all the multilateral institutions, regional institutions, every possible gathering that we call them as clusters or regional security architectures or whatever that we want to name them. All of them require some sort of rehauling. They require some sort of handholding. They also require to be alerted and probably sensitized on issues like this. In 2020, none of us imagined probably a health issue is going to shake up the whole world and make us to think about what we have done so far to the world. Right? There are benefits of such type of things, but at the same time, the cost has been extremely high. It's not just high, it's been extremely high. From that perspective, this humanitarian crisis is equally a security concern, a traditional security concern that has exposed the realities which we have probably tried putting it in the background and or backdrop, and we have been trying to fake for a very long time. But this is a hard-hitting message. The world is not going to be the same with things like this going to be coming in the forefront for a long time. So there is a necessity for us to live up to the occasion and then talk about in different manner. Here, the main argument that I try putting up is very simple. The global problems require global responses. Without that one, the global governance cannot sustain. Now, such global response is impossible if we don't create suitable political institutions at the global level. Now, political institution, now every institution from WHO to everything that's part of the global governance structure is political. So that's why these political institutions have to be strengthened, reworked, and then recreated for the betterment of the world. If anything that happens that's beyond the status quo is always helpful. It should not be on the negative side, but on the positive side, to have greater number of players who can actually also take up greater responsibilities. Now, therefore, we need global governance and create the adequate supranational structures also for this one. It's a simple thing. You don't need to be sort of a philosopher to understand this one, but at the same time, there is a necessity for us to have or open up our common sense to work at this juncture, which is going to be very, very helpful. Now, how do we exactly create these supranational institutions? How do we strengthen them? Is a collective action. I mentioned to you, governance means it's also something that's been taken through a collective understanding. It's also through transparency. It's also through accountability. It's also through rule of law. It also has to have some amount of empathy. That means, again, the 5 members who are part of the nuclear grouping, they shouldn't be talking about it. It's not the UNSC that has to decide, not just the great power or a super powers that have to sit and decide together. Probably it should be put up at the UN level, where General Assembly should talk about it, create greater institutions of responsibility, allow more and more suggestions to come from all over, and make it inclusive. That can actually be some sort of a solution or sort of a relative solution. I can say there are no definitive solutions, relative solutions if the global governance system has to sustain at this juncture. Now, this is very, very important that it has to be in one or the other way if we have to uplift our struggling institutions that have to happen. Now, crises also facilitate change, which is another. That's why crisis can be a catalyst for change, is something that we talk about. I've been, again, time and again, I've been emphasizing somebody's crisis is also somebody's opportunity. Now, this is crisis of the world. It is crisis for the whole world, and it's also an opportunity for the world to change a lot of things. We can come together to do all these things. So this can remove a lot of obstacles that are regularly found at the normal times. Now those things that were in the favor of the status quo, and to come out of the silos that many of these countries have built for probably decades and decades together. That's where the magnitude of this particular problem of the COVID-19 is posing. It requires, that's why I told you, extraordinary situations require extraordinary solutions, extraordinary ways of talking about. Crisis has also built leaders. It exposes leaders whom we all thought leaders for this long. Many of them have failed. Many of those people who won popular elections have been a failure now. Many of those people who claim themselves to be the sort of people who pull strings across the world in a lot of international affairs have been a failure. They have not had how to deal with it at all. They have not had a clue how to go about it. So it has to start with the domestic level to the international level, but it has to be inclusive. It has to have umpteen number of players. It has to bring them together. Then only we can have some sort of an answer to this. If global governance systems have to survive, if we need not doubt any of these institutions, there is a necessity for us to have such institutions which are much more open, and it has to live up to the word governance. If there is no governance there are no components of governance, the global governance is bound to fail, and that would lead to disaster probably, which can be a disaster of the greater magnitude than what we are facing as of now. Now we are already seeing sort of a crisis that has exposed most of the institutions of the global governance structure. It's going to be much more problematic. So let's have that inclusivity, or most of these players have to think from the inclusive perspective, and at the same time, live up to the true word and the meaning of the word governance. Probably I'll stop it here, and I would love to take up questions at this